Access to humanitarian funding. Di nanalo ang aming proposal sa donor pero pagkatapos ma-award sa international organization ang project, nilapitan kami ng nanalo para i-subcontract yung proyekto. Nang pumasok ang international NGO dito para mag-disaster response, ang daming staff ng local NGOs ang na-recruit dahil di naman namin kayang tapatan ang sweldo na ibinibigay nila. Ngayong tapos na ang proyekto, 2 na lang out of 13 local NGOs ang operational dito sa amin. Di raw neutral ang mga local actors kaya di kayang ma-access ang areas in conflict. Pero sa disaster coordination meeting, kami ang na-assign sa lugar na may conflict at lahat naman ng international NGOs ang pumosisyon sa mga barangay na nasa highway. Ilan lang ito sa mga kwento ng mga local organizations tungkol sa issue ng humanitarian localization at locally led response. During the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, it was recognized that the global humanitarian system was ineffective, inefficient, and funds were concentrated in the hands of international actors. Less than 2% of the global humanitarian funds were directly given to local actors. Through the grand bargain, donors and international NGOs agreed to transform the humanitarian system and increase direct funding to 25%. And yet, after 2019, direct funding to local organizations was just above 2%. The dialogues revealed that the issue of localization was not just about funding. The main goal was for local organizations to lead the disaster response. But ironically, much of the debates and localization campaigns were being led by international actors. Localization was a felt but not an explicitly discussed issue amongst local actors. There were varied definitions of localization and locally led response. Many were circular definitions of local actors who provided opportunities to lead humanitarian projects. This pointed out that the global debate was not about the romanticized role of local actors as first responders. Instead, local actors needed to have access and control over humanitarian funds and projects. Further elaboration pointed towards localization as the process of building strategic partnerships, sharing resources and capacities, and promoting an environment that enables local leadership in quality humanitarian interactions. With locally led response as an outcome, respondents defined it as local actors being empowered to drive relevant and timely humanitarian interactions towards people-centered development. From these, the issue of power of locals to lead was highlighted. The most frequently mentioned impediment to localization was the perceived low capacity and non-neutrality of local actors. But historically, networks of regional disaster response networks have been in existence since the 1990 North Luzon earthquake and the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption. Local actors were leading the responses with partner international non-government organizations supporting by raising funds. But when Super Typhoon Yolanda struck the country, the brandings of international actors adorned the tarpaulins in affected cities and communities. It is surprising that after decades of local leadership and continuous capacity building, local actors suddenly did not have disaster response capacity. Amongst local actors, the most frequently mentioned reason was the resistance of international actors to the implied shift in power. This meant less funds, less employment opportunities, and less control over humanitarian projects and partnerships for international actors. Another reason cited was the shrinking humanitarian funds available and the strong competition for these funds. However, allocations of foreign governments for the humanitarian assistance have been increasing in the past 2 decades. Not surprisingly, the trend of increasing direct implementation of international NGOs instead of supporting partner local NGOs coincided with this increase in funding. The study showed that international actors mostly receive their funds from foreign governments. For international NGOs, funds from their local supporters, affiliates, and United Nations agencies were also significant sources of funds. But for local actors, the primary source of funds were from their partnerships with international NGOs. For many, these international NGOs were existing partners in their development work. Local donors were also cited as significant sources of funds. The issue of competition for funds was true for international NGOs. But for local actors, maintaining their partnership with international NGOs and hoping that their funding streams were sustained were the main concerns. The real impediment to accessing large humanitarian funds were the ineligibility of local actors and the restrictive conditionalities of humanitarian grants. A key concern of the grant bargain was the numerous intermediary organizations between the first recipient of the funds and the affected community. For each organization where the funds pass, a certain percentage of the indirect costs is incurred. If the funds pass from the international NGO headquarters to the international NGO country program, to a national network or organization, to a local NGO, and finally to a community organization, the original funds left for the disaster-affected communities is already less than half. While the roles of the first recipient and the implementing organizations are clear, the role of the intermediary organizations are less appreciated. The intermediary organizations performed key functions in localization, particularly bridging and expanding the reach, filling competency gaps, sustaining capacity building, facilitating empowerment strategies such as community organizing, absorbing project risks in behalf of local actors, and ensuring quality work of local actors. If these roles are not assumed by the first recipient or the local organizations, the issues will persist with national, Manila-based actors substituting directly implementing international actors. Another issue aside from the quantity of funds is the quality of funds. It is recognized that humanitarian funding cannot be simply funds for goods and services for affected communities, even though many people or organizations still reported receiving this kind of funding. Quality funding pertains to the conditions of the duration of funds, its flexibility, the proposing and reporting requirements, and the immediate access of the funds. It also must include indirect operational and support costs, institutional and community development budgets, and institutional recovery costs. For direct costs, it should include costs to reach out to remote local organizations, compliance standards, preparedness and quick response funds, and process-oriented costs. Without these, humanitarian actions become highly restrictive, less inclusive, and short-sighted. Where there were more inclusive funding, better partnerships, and better quality funding, local actors were able to provide relevant and adaptive humanitarian action and interactions, fill gaps, and offer innovative alternative and complementary actions to responses of government, integrate gender and inclusion agenda into the humanitarian action, provide capacity development for local organizations and local government units. Struggling community-based actors directly affected by the disasters were able to quickly and better recover. The disaster response was also better connected to the existing community development work. How about you? What are your issues in accessing humanitarian funding? How do you envision locally led disaster response? How do you propose to address your issues and realize your vision? Your localization workshop is an opportunity for you to voice out your issues and your vision with other local actors.